Hello, gamers. People are asking for a lot of tier lists. Hull mod tier lists, ship tier lists, Omega tier lists. So instead of doing any of those, I'm going to give you the tier list that nobody asked for. Officer skills. Now, these are going to be very similar to the ratings they would get if used as a player, but one of the big differences here is I'm going to rate the elite bonuses separately from the baseline bonuses. For the player, that doesn't really matter. It's very easy to get the elite bonus on every skill that you pick for your player character. But with officers having limited amounts of elite skills that are separate from their skill count, it is worth rating them separately. So, we're going to start with the first one that shows up in the combat tier list, helmsmanship. It's pretty good, actually. I would rate this one very highly, because maneuverability is very valuable. Pretty much every ship in the game is going to want at least some maneuverability. Capitals want it for the turn rate, mostly, but what I didn't realize when I first started the game is maneuverability isn't just turn rate. It's also your acceleration and deceleration. So if you have a frigate that's driving forward at 200 units per second, and then suddenly decides that it's in danger and it needs to turn around, that is a delta V of 400. That's pretty big. So being able to decelerate and then accelerate again 50% faster is pretty useful. So at the start, when I first started playing the game, I thought maneuverability was really bad on frigates, but it turns out it's actually really good on frigates, just for different reasons. Capital ships with their lower top speed don't need the acceleration and deceleration as much, but the turn rate is extremely valuable. So overall, maneuverability is just generally valuable. Almost every ship is going to want some kind of 50% bonus, whether that's from helmsmanship or auxiliary thrusters, or some other source, like escort package. 15% top speed is also nice. It's kind of hard to get top speed. There's not a lot of ways to do it. Like if you look at hull mods, for example, you've got safety overrides or unstable injectors, both of which penalize your ship's range. Helmsmanship gives you that 15%, and it doesn't take your range away. It just, here you go, here's 15% top speed. On faster ships, that's pretty good. On slower ships, it's not a whole lot, but that's where, boom, the elite skill comes in, because the elite bonus is a flat plus 10. On a lot of capital ships, this is pretty irreplaceable, and in fact, I take this on almost every capital ship build, just because there's not really any other option. Your alternative is to take unstable injectors, which does give you a flat 15, but that 15% range penalty can be very, very punishing. On top of that, the zero flux speed boost, that is a lot stronger for the player because you can deliberately take advantage of that. But even when it's not a player and it's on an officer, it's still pretty useful. There are a fair number of situations where the AI is far enough away that the enemy's ballistic and energy weapons can't shoot at them, so they feel safe dropping their shields, but they're still in missile range, so they can't vent. Right? The problem with venting is that you can't stop. So if they start venting, then that shuts off their entire PD grid, and they're going to get blasted by harpoons or whatever. So they're in a situation where they're far enough that they can drop their shields, but they're still too close to actually vent. And in that situation, suddenly getting the zero flux boost and getting that plus 50 top speed can make a big difference in its survivability. It's a bit niche for the AI, but it's still nice. Alright, combat endurance. I think that's S tier. 15% combat readiness is a bit bland, but it's strong. That's 5% extra damage dealt, 5% reduced damage taken, across the board, so shields, armor, and hull, and also 5% top speed and maneuverability. On top of that, combat readiness also affects auto-fire accuracy. Yeah, for some reason, your ship's auto-fire weapons will just be really bad at their job when you're at like 40% combat readiness, whereas they're going to be really good at their job if you're at 100%. So getting that combat readiness maxed out is pretty important. And then combat endurance, like that by itself might not be S tier, but on top of that, 60% peak performance time and 25% reduced combat readiness degradation. There's a lot of ships that just want that by itself. even if they didn't have the combat readiness. In fact, there's a lot of ships where, let's say you've got hull restoration and crew training, they would still take combat endurance even though the combat readiness gets wasted. Like, a lot of phase ships are going to do that. Some frigates are going to do that if they have low peak performance. And you're definitely taking it if you've got safety overrides. So overall, it's just extremely versatile. Very good. Not always taking it. There are some niche situations where I wouldn't take it just because there's other skills that are a higher priority. But you can never really go wrong with it either. It's good on most builds. It's optimal, in fact, on a vast majority of builds. And you just can never go wrong with combat endurance. The elite bonus, however, is a bit more niche. It's pretty useful on hull tanks, so a lot more low-tech ships usually. But weirdly enough, the repair is also really good on phase ships, especially phase frigates. Because that repair speed, well, 50% of maximum hull does scale up nicely with large hull. The fact that it has a floor of 2,000 points means that, in theory, on a frigate, it can repair more than 100%. The problem is, with something like an Omen, that 0.5% is going to be really slow. Like, you're never going to get the full value out of it, and even if you do repair an Omen back to full hull, it's not going to make much of a difference in its survivability. But for phase ships, it's different, because phase ships don't generally take large hits. The AI is usually smart enough to avoid getting blasted by, like, attack units. So instead, they end up taking chip damage from, like, a heavy blaster or some tactical lasers, or maybe a few railgun shots here and there. And because they keep taking chip damage and then diving into phase, the elite bonus here actually does extend their longevity quite a bit. Especially since in phase space, time passes 3 times as fast, which means that they also repair 3 times as fast. If you've ever piloted an Afflictor yourself, you can really feel the difference combat endurance makes. I usually find that I die before getting to the end of a battle if I don't take it, and if I do take it, sometimes I end up using the full repair, the full 2,000 points, even though the Afflictor only has 1,500 hull. It just makes a very big difference. I really recommend it on phase ships. But partly why it's in B tier is that even on a lot of low-tech ships, usually armor taking is a priority over hull tanking. So investing in this is usually not what I would do. But it is pretty good at what it does, so I can't really rate it lower than B tier. Alright, impact mitigation. I'm going to put that in A tier. The reason for that is the second line, not the 25% armor damage, but the minus 50% weapon and engine damage taken. Yes, for armor tanks, the minus 25% armor damage is really good, but that 50% weapon and engine damage makes it surprisingly good even on ships that have pretty poor armor. A lot of battle cruisers, for example, like if I'm piloting the Odyssey, I'm going to prioritize this over field modulation. Partly because of the elite bonus, of course, but also because that 50% reduced engine damage can be the difference between life and death. For a lot of faster ships, like low-tech ships with slower engines can often survive the duration of a flameout, but a lot of faster ships that rely on shields and hit-and-run tactics, if their engines flame out, it's kind of game over. So reducing the damage your engine's taken by 15% makes a big difference. Like on the Aurora, that's the difference between... It makes a massive difference, especially against remnants, because they all have elite target analysis, which doubles their damage to weapons and engines. So if you're piloting an Aurora, which is usually a pretty good flagship, and their ion beams so much as tickle your engines, it's over. Like, your engines are flamed out instantly. Sure, you've got hardened shields to reduce the chance of an ion beam piercing your shields, but it doesn't block it completely. And if your engines get tickled, they're gone. They're too busy giggling. Impact mitigation stops that because it counteracts the bonus damage from elite target analysis. And so a lot of the time I even take this on the Aurora, which with only 800 armor, the armor effect is not that great. So I don't want to oversell it. You're not throwing this on every high-tech ship, obviously, but the fact that it's useful outside of its main niche, it's got that extra versatility that I think deserves A tier. The elite bonus is a bit more niche, but it is really good on cruisers and capitals, getting essentially auxiliary thrusters for 3. On a capital ship, that's 20 ordnance points that you get for just 1 elite skill. It's pretty good. The problem is that for frigates and destroyers, it only gives 25% maneuverability. Honestly, I'm not really sure why, because armor tanking is generally better on larger ships anyways, so the first part of the skill tends to be better on larger ships. So then the elite bonus also being better on larger ships seems a bit odd. Like, you would think they'd... I don't know what the point of that is, but that is the way that it is. So it ends up being a bit more narrow, even though it is really good. Next, we're looking at damage control. This is the basic hull tanking skill. There's a defensive skill for everything, right? You've got armor, hull, shields. Plus, I guess you can count point defense as a defensive skill. I mean, it's not really doing much else. Anyways, 25% hull damage taken, 50% faster weapon and engine. I'm going to put that in B tier. It's still good at what it does, but it's a lot more niche than impact mitigation. 50% faster repair is nice, but it's not as good as just reducing the damage they take in the first place. Similarly, 25% reduced hull damage is nice, but reducing armor damage is usually going to be better. Now, it does also, because armor tanking is generally better than hull tanking, because hull damage also translates to crew losses, on top of the fact that by the time they get through your armor and then they start doing damage to your hull, now you're losing crew, and the repair costs are going to be a lot higher. Whereas if you can have your armor tank everything, not only do you preserve your crew, you're just taking less damage overall. Like the cost benefit analysis favors armor tanking a lot more. Now, damage control does somewhat mitigate this with reduced crew losses from hull damage, but you still are losing crew. So overall, it doesn't have the same versatility. It's not quite as good, but it still does what it does fairly well. The elite bonus is also B tier. You don't always want it, but when you do want it, it's pretty good. Being able to continually repair even while you're taking damage. With the right setup, that means that your weapons and engines just never shut off, no matter how much EMP the enemy throws at you. Like, if you combine this with an S-modded repair unit, which reduces repair times by 75%, and then you throw in, like, impact mitigation, like, good luck shutting anything off, right? They're just constantly repairing at an insane speed and taking 50% reduced damage. Like, automated repair unit is good even when you don't have this bonus. But combined with this bonus, it basically makes you, oh boy, EMP is crying in the corner because it is scared of the monster under the bed, and that monster is elite damage control. This bonus is a lot better than a lot of the past bonuses. Like, the original bonus that it was like reduced hull damage, but it had like a cooldown. It would reduce hull damage from like big hits and then it had like a 2-second cooldown, which was really weird. And then the next bonus that he was thinking about doing was actually an offensive bonus, increasing the ship's hull damage dealt, which would be strong, but just kind of feels off. This one, I like it a lot. It's not as strong as some of the other elite bonuses, being only in B tier, but it does have its uses. Alright, field modulation. This really depends on whether you're using it on a shielded ship or a phase ship. On a phase ship, I would put it in A tier, or maybe even, well, we'll get to the elite bonus in a second, but the baseline effect, A tier on a phase ship. But on shielded ships, I'd say it's only really B tier. Like, you compare this to, like a comparison I made earlier. 50% maneuverability that you get from elite impact mitigation or from helmsmanship is about equivalent to auxiliary thrusters, which is a 20-point hull mod on a capital ship. Field modulation, when compared to hardened shields, is really sad. not only does it give you a lower bonus to your shields, 15% instead of 20%, hardened shields also reduces the penetration of EMP weapons like ion beams and tachyon lances, where field modulation doesn't do any of that. It's just not as good as impact mitigation. Now, it is versatile, because even low-tech ships are going to appreciate better shield efficiency. Obviously, it's going to be better on ships with more flux capacity, but no one's going to turn their nose up at a bit more efficiency. It's just the number is really low. That's part of the reason why sometimes you're actually going to prefer impact mitigation, because preserving your engines means more than a little more shield efficiency in some cases. Elite bonus. For phase ships, I would put it in S tier. Actually even higher than the baseline bonus. That 50% reduced phase cloak cooldown makes a massive difference to your ship's survivability. Sometimes people complain that phase ship AI is bad and that they keep dying. I have to assume that you're not using elite field modulation, because for phase ships, that vulnerability window, when they unphase and there's a 2-second cooldown, that's when they're vulnerable. That's when they can die. Taking it from 2 seconds down to 1 second massively reduces their casualty rate. They do not die. But for regular ships that don't have phase coils, it's kind of a B tier. Honestly, maybe even a C tier. It's a very low priority. I can't really put it in C tier, though, because it is very good on ships like the Monitor or the Paragon, where they have fortress shields. It's very, very good when synergized with that. But outside of that niche, it's kind of meh. It's kind of okay. Like, the idea of dissipating through shields sounds really nice, but you run into this very simple problem, which is that if you're in combat and your shields are up, most of your dissipation is going to your weapons. And in fact, sometimes the dissipation isn't even enough and you're overfluxed, which is usually the correct thing to do. Usually you want to be a little over your dissipation so that your ship can pump out more damage using its capacity as sort of a buffer. Because of that, you're not really getting any value out of it when you're in direct combat. And then when you back out of combat, what happens? Well, your ship drops its shield so it can dissipate. So the range where you actually get to use that elite bonus is a lot more narrow than you think. So while being able to dissipate through shields even a little bit does sound like a game changer, it ends up not making as much of a difference as you would like. Not necessarily bad, but usually not a priority. Point defense. I'm also going to put that in B tier. 50% bonus damage to fighters and missiles can be a very big difference. For something like a burst laser or flak cannon, this can be the difference between 2-shotting a missile and 1-shotting a missile. And that can be a big difference. Like your flak cannon being able to one-shot, especially if it's the dual flak cannon with its high rate of fire, being able to one-shot missiles is the difference. Like, that's in a way ends up doubling its DPS, because it's only firing 1 shot per missile instead of 2 shots per missile, right? By passing over like specific damage thresholds. So even though it only says 50%, it can end up being more effective than that. So it is pretty good at what it does, and it synergizes very nicely with armor tanking, because the main thing that's going to be threatening to an armor tank is torpedoes, things like Reapers, that massive high explosive shots that can strip off your armor. So being able to shoot those down reliably, that is a pretty big deal. The elite bonus. Now, some people get this mixed up because the first part says it affects piloted ship and fighters from piloted ship. That only applies to the 50% bonus damage. That does not apply to the elite bonus. So taking elite point defense does not increase a broadsword's machine gun range by 200. I'm sorry. But it does increase your point defense weapons, and in the right situation, it can increase other weapons too. If you S-mod integrated point defense AI, it turns all of your small weapons, aside from missiles, of course, into point defense weapons. It used to turn the antimatter blaster too, but then they changed that, which maybe they should revert that, but setting that aside, being able to give your small weapons a flat 200 range is a big deal, because small weapons usually have less range. Now, this used to be a lot better, but something changed, which is the introduction of ballistic rangefinder. See, ballistic rangefinder also adds a bonus range, but unlike this, which is a flat bonus, ballistic rangefinder is also affected by your targeting unit. So if you're... So on something like the Manticore, for example, it adds a 200 bonus range to its small weapons, but then that gets further boosted by like a targeting unit or gunnery implants. Whereas the flat bonus from point defense does not get that, and importantly, these two things are incompatible, because ballistic rangefinder does not apply to point defense weapons, whereas this elite bonus only applies to point defense weapons, so you can't do both. Meaning that for ballistic weapons, ballistic rangefinder is the choice most of the time. So now, going with S-modded point defense AI, and then applying elite point defense, is pretty much reserved for small energy weapons. And it no longer applies to the antimatter blaster. So really the only thing it's doing for you, like most of the time you're really only applying this to the IR pulse laser and the ion cannon. And that is usually not worth it. Like, that's a big investment to improve weapons that are usually a lower priority. So it's like flat 200 range is good, but I think I could only put it at B tier because there's a lot more limitations on it now. Like for small ballistics, it's competing with ballistic rangefinder. Small energies, it doesn't apply to the antimatter blaster anymore. And increasing your your just regular point defense weapons by 200 range is pretty good, but not insane. All right, target analysis. I'm putting it in A tier, but I almost feel like after the change in the last patch, it's not as mandatory. Because you'll notice if you don't get the elite bonus, it only boosts your damage against cruisers and capitals. Now, the effect from target analysis is pretty unique in that it's not additive. So most damage bonuses add together. So a 5% here, if I have 5% here and 10% there, they add together to 15%. But if I have a 10% somewhere else and then I throw in target analysis, they actually multiply together. So that 20% against capital ships not only increases the base damage of the weapon, but it also increases any other damage bonuses I have. That's pretty good, because extra damage means not only extra DPS, it's also extra flux efficiency, because you're getting extra damage for free, and then also extra hit strength, making it better against armor. So the damage bonuses at 15 and 20% are really good, but they only apply to cruisers and capitals, meaning that for ships that are mostly focused on dueling with enemy frigates, like maybe you've got some frigates that are designed to fight over the capture points and fend off enemy frigates, well then, they mostly just want to avoid cruisers and capitals, so they don't really need this skill, which makes it a lot less generically useful as it was before. Now, most of the time your ships are not going to be so specialized. Most of the time you want them to be able to kill enemy cruisers and capitals as well. But I think it's not as generic as it used to be. The elite bonus is also A tier, mostly for that plus 100% damage to weapons and engines, but 10% to destroyers and 5% to frigates is good. And the reason I say it's mostly for that 100% to weapons and engines is because it's 100%. If you've got any EMP weapon damage, any weapons that deal EMP damage from your ship, this is almost an automatic pick at that point, because it effectively doubles any EMP damage you're doing. Like, hey, you've got a Tachyon Lance? Congratulations, it now does twice as much EMP damage as before. Oh yeah, and also more damage to frigates and destroyers. That's pretty good. That's pretty good. Ballistic Mastery. A tier. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. You're using ballistic weapons, here's 10% more damage and 10% more range. Have at it. It's just generically good. Hard to really say much about it. The elite bonus, on the other hand, there's a lot more I could say about this. I think this might be S tier, because anytime you take ballistic mastery, you're pretty much always going to take the elite bonus as well. Like, if you're taking just the baseline skill and not grabbing the elite bonus, it feels like a huge waste, because that extra projectile speed makes such a massive difference. The only time where I might take the baseline skill and not the elite bonus is on something like a Lasher or a Centurion. You know, like a frigate, because they don't have that much range. But on destroyers and up and onwards, the extra accuracy and from that 33% projectile speed is just huge. It makes the Hellbore actually hit things other than capitals. It makes railguns consistently hit frigates even at medium to long range. It just massively, because every shot you miss isn't just missed damage, it's also wasted flux. So missing shots not only lowers your DPS, it also lowers your efficiency. Getting that 33% projectile speed just makes a big difference. And then on top of that, it's got a 5% extra bonus damage, just in case the extra projectile speed wasn't enough. Systems expertise. Now this is where things get a little interesting, because I think the skill by itself is A tier, where it's very good on the ships that it's good on, but it's not. But there's a lot of ships where it's just kind of useless. So I think by itself I would put that in A tier, but that's where we get into officer mechanics a bit more. So the way that this works is that for missile specialization and systems expertise, they don't show up at level 2 or 3. Now, sometimes you can find officers with missile specialization at level 1, but setting that kind of exception aside, these two skills don't show up at level 1, 2, or 3. But then they're guaranteed to show up every level after that. So 4, 5, and 6, if you've got officer training, they're guaranteed to show up, even if you don't pick them. What this means is that for the other skills, there's some amount of unreliability. You're not guaranteed to get them, even if you mentor your officer to increase your options. But for these skills, you know you're going to get them. And in fact, if you want both of them, you can get both of them. Because if you pick one at level 4, the other one just continues to show up at levels 4, at 5, and 6. It's like once you hit level 4, they're just always there until you pick them. And I think that extra level of reliability means that builds that use these are a lot more, you can more consistently put them together. And for that reason, I'm going to put it in S tier. The elite bonus, minus 10% damage taken. From compared to field modulation, I'm going to put that in S tier. I think that's really good because it improved shield efficiency, improved armor tanking, and improved hull tanking. I mean, it's 10% doesn't sound like a lot, but that's 2/3 of the bonus field modulation gives you. That's 2/3. Plus, it also improves your armor and hull tanking. Like this is a rare case where an elite skill is better than a basic skill, which is a bit mean because field modulation has been tuned down quite a lot to keep high tech in check. But still, I think it is very good. It's a good option to take if you've got systems expertise already. Missile specialization. I mean, it's got the same thing going for it that systems expertise has, as I've already said. I mean, the missile hit points get nerfed from 50% to 25%, but it's still going to be S tier. Now, when it comes to elite bonus, people say some weird things about missile rate of fire, saying things like, oh, sometimes missile rate of fire is a nerf because it means your AI wastes more missiles. That generally shouldn't happen. The main situation where that's going to happen is if you've got a loadout where the missiles are like somehow longer range than your other weapons. I mean, that's pretty normal on frigates. But like in a situation where it's got longer range missiles than its other weapons, and the missiles by themselves can't do any damage. So an example of this might be the Squall, where the Squall was going to outrange your other weapons, and while it does good kinetic damage, as soon as the enemy drops their shields, then it's just kind of doing nothing. And so that might waste its ammo, and 25% it wastes its ammo faster. The thing is, that's pretty niche. Usually what it means is you just kill the enemy faster. Like 25% extra rate of fire on an Annihilator, for example. Like, I've heard arguments that like it makes it worse because it's wasting its ammo faster. But if you kill the enemy faster, that means that their point defense has less uptime. If it takes me 10 seconds to kill them with my Annihilators because I just burn through their hull so much faster, I mean, you know, I'm obviously not just kind of making up these numbers, then that means that like 10 seconds versus 15 seconds, right? That's 5 extra seconds where their point defense is shooting back. right? So by killing them faster, you reduce the uptime on their point defense, which means that you waste fewer missiles killing them. So your rate of fire means you burn through them faster, but you also kill the enemy faster, so you end up actually saving ammo, usually. Like, in most cases, you're going to save ammo. And that's not even getting into the weapons that have so much ammo that they usually still have like 50% by the end of a battle. There's a lot of weapons, a lot of missile weapons, like the Squall being a good example of a weapon where if you've got missile specialization and you've got expanded missile racks, unless you're fighting like 5 Ordos, if you're fighting 2 or 3 even, you're still going to have plenty of ammo by the end. So that extra rate of fire is just increasing the DPS at that point. So that 25% is really good, on top of 10% extra damage. So they just do more damage. No extra, burning rate involved. And then also now they increased missile weapon ammo regeneration, which for human weapons only really applies to the pylum. But of course, once mega weapons get involved, then it just becomes insanely good, because all of their missile weapons have regenerating ammo. Yeah, this is a pretty easy S tier as well. Alright, now onto the technology, the blue ones. Gunnery implants. That's pretty A tier. So that first bonus, plus 100% target leading accuracy for auto-firing weapons. That goes back to what I said earlier about combat readiness affecting auto-fire accuracy. Basically, what 100% means is that auto-fire accuracy is always treated at maximum, because it caps out at 100. So going over 100 doesn't do anything, which means that plus 100% it basically just puts you to 100%. Even if your ship is at 0% CR, it's still treated as 100% for the purposes of your auto-fire accuracy. It's kind of like that line of text on Integrated Point Defense AI where it says, your point defense weapons always get the best target leading accuracy, regardless of combat readiness. Gunnery implants basically does the same thing, but for all your weapons. So on ships, if you have a build where you don't have maxed out combat readiness, because other things were a priority, usually it's going to involve gunnery implants as well to give you that little bit of extra accuracy. Although that part of it is really not that important compared to the other two parts, which is 15% ballistic and energy weapon range. I mean, it's 15% range. That's always pretty good. And then minus 25% weapon recoil. Between these two effects, it tends to be better on ballistic ships than on a lot of energy ships. Because ballistic ships have higher base range, they're getting more of that 15%. And then most energy weapons have 0 recoil, whereas very few ballistic weapons have 0 recoil, so 25% weapon recoil is more relevant on ballistic ships, but it's still good on a lot of energy ships anyways. So it's something that you're very rarely going to feel bad about unless you're piloting like a Griffin. And even then, it's like a little extra point defense range, so why not? I mean, why not? Because there's other higher priorities, but it's not doing nothing. Now, the elite bonus is weird. I'm going to put it in B tier. On frigates, it's really good with that 4%, but then you get to destroyers, 2% is questionable. And obviously, you're just like 1% on cruisers and capitals is just like it's a little bonus you get if like that's irrelevant for your officers. You're just never going to take that. On a destroyer, it's questionable. On a frigate, it's pretty good. Like 4% ECM is what you get from an ECM package on a capital ship, and that costs 24 ordnance points. So getting that by spending an elite skill on a frigate is pretty nice. The only problem is, you usually don't take this on frigates. The 50% extra range is usually not relevant. So a lot of the time, if you do take elite gunnery implants on a frigate, it's because there's just nothing else that you want, and so you figure you might as well get some ECM, even if the baseline skill isn't adding too much value. So overall, I'm going to put that in B tier. Energy weapon mastery. Yeah, you might be noticing I haven't used C or D tier. Well, we're not using it yet because energy weapon mastery is B tier. 30% damage is a big number. It's the biggest number, actually. That's a lot. The only problem is it comes with a couple caveats. First, is it only gets that full bonus below 600 range, and then it scales down towards 0 beyond 1000 range. Okay, so you've got to be close to the enemy. But on top of that, you've got to have high flux. So if you're at 50% flux and the enemy is 800 range away, you're only getting a 7.5% damage bonus. It's a lot less than what was advertised. So the potential here is really high, but the conditions at play make it a lot more limited, and that's deliberate. It's compared to Ballistic Mastery, which is just kind of like you slap it on to basically any ballistic ship and it's going to do good. This is a lot more narrow. Now, luckily, a lot of the late game enemies tend to be very reckless, like the Remnants. So I've heard people say that Energy Whip Mastery is not very good on, say, the Paragon because it has so much range. And I actually find the opposite to be true, because I take this on the Paragon because Remnants are going to drive straight up to your shields. Like, yes, the range on the Paragon is really good, but it's also really slow. So if you're being attacked by a reckless enemy that wants to get in your face, they're going to get into your face. And being able to kill them faster is pretty useful. So the damage bonus is a little more narrow compared to its ballistic counterpart, but it's like the fact that it scales up to such a big number under the right circumstances kind of makes up for the fact that it's a bit conditional. The elite bonus is, of course, a lot more generically good and significantly better. I'd put it in A tier, just minus 10% flux generated. It's simple, it's straightforward, it's nice. Ordnance expertise, I'm going to put that in S tier. Now, it did get nerfed, so maybe S tier is a bit much, but even after the nerf, that extra flux dissipation, because it's a flat number, tends to be better and have a more impact on lower tech ships that have a lower baseline. Right? Giving, say, let's say plus 300 flux dissipation. If your ship's baseline is 1,000, then that's a 30% increase. Whereas if you've got like a Paragon, which is at 2,000, then that plus 300 is only a 15% increase, right? So proportionally, it has more of an impact on lower tech ships. But it does enough that it's still good on high tech ships. I still take this on the Paragon, even though it has such high dissipation as it is. So the main thing that this scales with really is going to be large amounts of ordnance points. So ships like the Onslaught and the Paragon love taking this. Interestingly enough, it also counts ordnance points spent on fighters, which makes it really good on battle carriers, because normally battle carriers have this tough choice between spending points on their fighters or spending points on their combat capabilities. But thanks to ordnance expertise, you can spend points on your fighters, and that converts straight into combat effectiveness with that extra dissipation. So that's pretty cool. It's just generically useful. Not always the best option, but I mean, who's going to say no to more flux, am I right? On the other hand, the elite bonus, that extra capacity is pretty pitiful. And I find myself very rarely taking it. Even in kind of like the ideal scenario of like a Manticore loadout, where all of the stuff that I need to make it work leaves it with like 2 capacitors. So it's got very, very low flux, meaning that the ordnance expertise, it's at the highest potential return on that flat bonus. And it's barely better, than just getting elite systems expertise. And that's talking about shield strength. That's just talking purely about shield strength. Like the 10% damage reduction from systems expertise, it provides like 3/4 of the same extra shield strength that I would get from the elite ordnance expertise, while also reducing hull and armor damage. Like, it's like a nice little bonus on your player, but for the AI, this ends up being a surprisingly small bonus, which is probably fine, to be honest, giving all of the ships and giving it, like if it went up to 30, for example, and you start taking this on more ships, it'd be kind of annoying, because it's a relatively uninteresting bonus of just like, ooh, more flux. Here you go. So instead, having the other elite skills be more of a priority overall I think is more interesting. So I wouldn't actually ask for a buff on this. I think it's fine as it is. But I think most of the time, your other elite skills higher on this tier list are a higher priority. Alright, and then we get to the last skill, polarized armor. I'm going to put this in B tier because it is very good on ships that have a lot of armor. But that's kind of it. Right? Like, yeah, it's going to be really good on your Onslaught or your Dominator or your Invictus. But are you going to take this on a Manticore? You may be on an Enforcer, if it's like a 14 variant with heavy armor. But like, are you going to take this on an Eagle? Probably not. That increased armor damage reduction is just very, very bad on frigates. Like, it's kind of useless on frigates. Like, impact mitigation, the improved armor tanking isn't great on frigates, but at least the 50% reduced weapon and engine damage is nice. Now, polarized armor has a similar effect with the EMP damage reduction, but it's the same effect, just worse. Right, 50% reduced weapon and engine damage applies to damage from all weapons, including EMP weapons. This only applies to EMP weapons, and it scales off your hard flux. So if you're only at half hard flux, then you're only getting 25% EMP damage reduction. So it is exactly the same effect, the secondary effect on impact mitigation, but worse. So whenever it comes to, if you're in a situation where you're making a ship that's got decent armor and you want to improve it with a skill, and you've only got one extra skill slot left, and you've got to choose between impact mitigation and polarized armor, you're pretty much always going to choose impact mitigation first. On top of the fact that impact mitigation is more versatile. So while this is a good complement to impact mitigation and can make some armor tanks very impressive, it's kind of like an auxiliary, right? It's the secondary that you take after you've already got the primary skill, which is impact mitigation. And then there's that elite bonus, which is pretty good on a player flagship. It's kind of, it feels almost mandatory on the Invictus, so that you can actually finish venting before your system comes off cooldown. But for the AI, I'm going to put that in D tier. I basically never take this. I've tried to make it work on the AI, and it's just not very good. Like, yes, the AI does vent in combat sometimes, but it's very conservative with the venting, and for good reason, because if you see your AI ships vent in the face of an enemy and then die, you're going to be very upset about it. It's like, what is the AI doing? It's dying for no reason. So it's very conservative with venting. It does do it, but very rarely. And for that reason, it very rarely actually benefits from this skill. While the player can make a lot of use out of it, I would put it in D tier as an elite skill for the officers in the game. And so that covers everything. That's about it. See ya.